Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Chapter 7. I'm going to be talking about Chapter 7 in the Environmental Management book. I think that some parts of the book are a bit of a repetition of things that some of you may already know, or some things that you may have already thought about. We all understand that it's very difficult to grasp climate change because it can feel so overwhelming to us that we have grown up having a particular kind of climate on average, the occasional extreme weather event that maybe it hasn't rained in Malmö for almost a month or something like that. Or it seems like it's rained every day for a month. But anyway, and of course, because climate change is, well, a threat, shall we say, in various ways to natural ecosystems and to society in general. On the one hand, the threats can seem very abstract and very hard to grasp or ephemeral. And everything seems very potentially dangerous, but maybe not quite yet. And that's what maybe what we have is that even 10 years ago, that there would be people that feel that things felt potentially very dangerous, but maybe it wasn't going to come quite yet. And what we see at a global level, we see global changes, but we see that it's sort of slow, creeping changes in various places around the world, punctuated by some sort of an extreme event, like a series of floods that were unusually difficult or long periods of drought. So we all sort of feel, those of us who are aware of the potential with climate change, we all sort of feel that, well, maybe today is a normal weather day, but it feels like just around the corner something might happen. And that leaves us all a bit on edge. If we're walking around in a city that we're not familiar with, and we know that there are a few neighborhoods that might be a little rough, and you don't quite know where those are, and you walk around a corner and suddenly, oh, maybe I shouldn't be here, that kind of feeling. Now, I'm going to assume that you're taking the environmental studies course program so that you have some sort of environmental interest and climate change interest. But there are a large number of people where climate change is a weak signal. By saying weak signal, we can link that back to a previous lecture. That it isn't that it's entirely unimportant and not relevant, but those people don't have thinking about nature, thinking about relationships between society and nature as some of the central points in defining those people's lives. So their view of the world is quite different than many of our view of the world. And then the question is, how can we make sure that the weak signal becomes a bit stronger for those people? What we have in terms of social systems in society are entirely too short-term to actually deal very well with climate change. Because countries that are democracies, and even countries that are maybe pseudo-democracies with some sort of element of democratic control and some sort of elections, even though it's not a complete democracy, there's a question of legitimacy. And many people want politicians to do more about climate change, whereas others don't want them to do anything more than what they're already doing. And the politicians tend to want to be re-elected. And we can see this, how there are disputes within political parties, even at this moment, about how far do they want to go in the area of climate change. The political parties mentioned, do you know which one which ones I'm talking about? If you're following in traditional media, and to the extent, how can we appear to be doing something with regard to the climate, at the same time we are trying to attract voters that might not be so interested in climate issues. And at an individual level, some people just become very passive, whereas others might have the other extreme, that they, if they can, they buy some sort of small house in the countryside with land and start becoming growing potatoes and wheat and having chickens or something like that. And they're preparing themselves for the doomsday that's coming. And of course, the majority of people fall somewhere in between there, hopefully in a constructive way. Now, we could have this talk about framing and discourse and so forth on a constructive perspective in another course and look at climate change. For example, we could have an environmental psychology course, or we could have it in an environmental sociology course. So we could see that there's an overlap here of using some of these terms and using this way of seeing things. If we're going to have a critical look or have some sort of critical environmental management, and as we understand that the authors of the book are very critical to what they call as conventional environmental management, even though we have achieved some things, it's not enough. And we need to put environmental management in a context. When and who are making decisions and how are the decisions made and based on what ideas. And so the debate about climate change in society, which influences how companies deal or don't deal with certain climate change issues, is the result of some sort of framing which is taking place. The debate is constructed. Our understanding of climate change is constructed primarily from a natural science perspective, but also with some kind of social science perspective. And during hundreds of years, humans and the organizations that they work within or that they lead have made a series of decisions leading to the situation we have today. A carbon-based energy economy is the term that they're using there. They're not looking so much at agriculture. And of course, as we understand during recent months, that the majority of farmers in Sweden are dependent upon diesel to run their equipment. And so perhaps the farmers should have been realizing and trying to figure out, well, how can we run our equipment on something which wouldn't be so expensive? Maybe we could take some of our agricultural waste and produce some sort of biodiesel that we could use to reduce our long-term costs. And there are some farmers that have done that, and the others have been telling us that it's too expensive. So I don't think they've been preparing themselves, or they're not getting, it's not considered a sector which was required support to prepare themselves for a, maybe not non-fossil fuel economy, but at least a low fossil fuel economy. You could have some equipment that is run on diesel now could be run using electricity, and they could have wind power, solar power to help run that. And then they could, or that you could have groups of farmers that could go become collectives in helping each other to produce their own fuel. Now, the book authors tend to sort of say, well, this is based on the economy, all these decisions were made. Well, it's the story, of course, isn't entire that simple. That there were some technical limitations 200 years ago about what could be done. It would have perhaps been possible to take a somewhat different development path and emphasize certain technical developments, but it's a sort of a mix between economic decisions, the benefit to organizations that make certain decisions as in the past. And there was really not the right kind of awareness during the early stages of the Industrial Revolution to think about the environment. So they're right in the book, but at the same time, maybe they have those who are criticizing complexity and say it's oversimplified. Perhaps they are making it a bit more simple. However, it is correct that we can see that through the last 250 years, there have been periods of time when technical innovations have appeared in clusters, or they have been developed at approximately the same period of time. And new technologies in engineering and mining and transport and agriculture, but also ideas or lack of ideas about urban planning plus general manufacturing. Sometimes these changes have occurred in clusters. And one technical innovation assists in the development of another technical innovation. And when this occurs, then we have, in the past at least, had in some countries where these innovations originated or when they were most fully developed, we saw a lot of economic growth in the classical definition of that. And then when the effects of those clusters have sort of diminished a bit, then we see a period of relative stagnation. But that's another lecture linked into world system analysis, of course. And as they suggest, there's nothing natural or inevitable about what we have today. We have powerful interests that wanted to further their interests in the past. And sometimes there were coincidental, unintended consequences. of certain technical innovations that ended up being used in ways that weren't originally intended. That does occasionally happen. Just like Zoom, it was designed for a meeting, but now it's being used for teaching, which is one of my pet peeves to talk about. So when we have a series of these technological innovations that are linked to each other, then things tend to be sort of entrenched. It becomes not just in my interest that my technology is successful and my organization is successful, but there are other technologies, innovations that I have a vested interest in seeing developments with that. And we can think about the car industry wants to make sure that the oil industry is healthy and vice versa, even though they are in some ways two completely different sectors. And we have all run into people who deny climate change, but here they are talking about some sort of a history of what has happened, what has led to this, that there's been a lot of somewhat hidden, but maybe not entirely hidden, political and economic groups originating among certain elites and certain politicians in the United States. They saw it in their interest, for whatever reason, to make sure that we would retain a high carbon economy using lots of fossil fuels. Also, perhaps thinking that being a vegetarian is just being stupid or something like that, even though that's not the primary part of this sort of alliance of groups of people that, to some extent behind the scenes and to some extent very overtly, have been denialists, and a lot of money has been spent. And as they say in the book, these denialists haven't said that environmental protection was bad, because they realized that if they did that, they would lose the argument. And if they began arguing with, for example, the IPCC directly on the terms of the IPCC, they realized that they would probably lose. So what did they do instead? They learned from previous efforts to try to indirectly attack by discrediting individual scientific researchers, by finding a handful of so-called scientists who had no academic background in climate change or related subjects, and fund their research. And by the way, maybe you should attend a press conference and say something. So all this has meant that in a country like the United States, that key decisions that have been made in other countries have been avoided. There have been some decisions made that would be, in a marginal way, reduce the increase in fossil fuel use, but the key core economic interests on the part of some powerful elites has been maintained. And once they achieve some sort of success with this, then, well, the next step is to try to spread this to other places around the world, to support people that might have similar ideas in other countries, and to also try to influence governments in other places around the world to not just have the United States be the exception in international climate negotiations. And of course, there are some oil-producing countries that also want us to go as slow as possible because their economic interests are threatened. And we can see that this has led to some mixed results. By and large, it seems that it's been very difficult to export in the long term this way of thinking, this sort of alliance, this hidden alliance, this network to other countries, that there's been a more robust belief in the truth of science, so to speak. But we do see that at some point, perhaps international climate negotiations should have moved on from emissions to something closer to what is the ultimate source of the emissions. But thus far, international climate change negotiations have had their focus on emissions and not from mining, extracting, and drilling per se, because this would make it possible for the powerful economic interest to continue to exploit fossil fuel resources and say, hey, it's the emissions that are the problem. It's not that we're drilling for oil in some place where it's getting increasingly difficult to extract the oil, but they need to keep doing this so that their shareholder value is kept up, so the value of the company is kept up. And so then there's this sort of mobilization which seems to keep certain things off the agenda. At least that's the idea that is suggested in the book. There are some IPCC-related scientists, those that have been involved for a few years, those who have not. The majority of climate scientists have some sort of connection to IPCC, that they could have been involved in the writing of a particular chapter during 5 or 6 years, that they monitor certain developments and then they put that into a chapter and report. They could also function as a reviewer, like a peer review, or they could have an administrative task sort of coordinating the writing of a number of different chapters in one of IPCC reports for a number of years, and then they leave, which is generally what happens. And some of these people have withstood a fair amount of discrediting because something they just happened to say that was taken out of context, or they use a metaphor that is easy to criticize. And as I said before, it would be difficult for some of these denialists to win if they approach the IPCC head on. So therefore, the strategy has been to try to subvert the message and to instill in everyone's mind a certain sense of insecurity. Well, maybe because the scientists aren't entirely sure, that means that we don't have to do anything. And of course, as we understand from natural science, one, there is a socialization in many forms of natural science that you are very careful in what you say until you are 110% sure. And then two, then you have your preliminary results and you say that they're preliminary, even though you feel rather confident in them, but you want to wait until 6 or 11 other researchers teams come to similar results before you can start to feel more comfortable and that you can together say that this is now a fact. And there always is the possibility, even though if it might be very small, that a better explanation comes along. So this is just part of the way that certain branches of research act and behave. And of course, also in the social sciences, at least some of them, there's a certain carefulness about how not wanting to sort of overstate your claims. And before you think that it's just the United States where climate change denialers live, here's this document, which I figure must be their own document, their own picture, because it was not sort of listed there, but it does say it's, so they created their own document, their own picture based on YouGov there. And we can see that that Indonesia seems to be the place in the world with the greatest number of denialers, closely followed by the United States and Saudi Arabia. So the US is bad, but it's not necessarily always the worst. I comfort myself in being able to say that. The book suggests that there are 3 ways that climate change discourse has been framed: gradualism, catastrophism, and denialism, with the latter being going from denialing completely to what we see now more of a, yes, the climate might be changing, but not as fast as suggested, or but now there's nothing we can do about it, or but it wouldn't be profitable, or whatever the word is, but it's a sort of variation on that. They also talk about how economists among social scientists are the ones that have been most active in framing the social science component of climate change. Early on, when the discourse about climate change and research about climate change was dominated by the natural sciences, it was first that economists sort of got on board and started framing those parts of the social science take on climate change based on their ideas. And of course, economics is important, but what we have is that the solutions which are suggested by economists aren't necessarily, looking at a entire societal perspective, aren't necessarily ones that might be the best, or looking at a company perspective. And then they have this discussion here about, well, yes, there are forms of systems thinking everywhere, but look, natural scientists have both negative and positive feedback loops, whereas economists aren't, in their way of viewing systems, only using certain kinds of loops. They're sort of missing out. And in this sense, they are perhaps the wrong kind of social scientists to take the dominant lead in the social science interpretation and framing and talking and discourse about climate change, is their suggestion. And we have this report, which is about 14, 15, 16 years old. This a very extensive economic analysis of climate change and what kind of measures should be done based on calculations on returns on investment. A British Sir or Lord who used to be a key figure in the World Bank, Nicholas Stern, and then everyone refers to this. Of course, the IPCC is referred to primarily various reports, the occasional report which isn't included in the IPCC, and then we have this Stern review. And that's it. Where are the other kinds of social sciences that have made some sort of a dominant impact? They're really not there. And we come back again to their talk about the need for experiments and exploration and scenarios within companies to try to figure out what other kind of alternative environmental management might be right for them. And they also stick it to the economists again and say, how can the economists dare to say that they know more about human behavior than psychologists? A rational man as a model is only one kind of way of viewing human behavior, which is correct in certain limited situations, but economists seem to suggest that this is the primary way humans think about things and act. So it becomes very odd that psychologists, the real deal, aren't being involved more in the discourse of climate change. And instead, we have to listen to the economist version of psychology as an example of how wrong sometimes the dominance of the economic science in the social science interpretation and framing of climate change is. Again, their critique of that by talking about emissions all the time, we're missing some of the things which are taking place behind that. It's just like, as you will see at some point when we come to environmental management systems in a coming course, that once upon a time, the dominant discourse about what environmental problems were and the dominant way companies thought about environmental problems were the emissions. And then once upon a time, suddenly some companies woke up and realized that that was just a symptom of another problem. And thanks to that awareness, there's a definition of, there's a way to analyze environmental problems that exists in environmental management systems, which we'll come to in another course, which perhaps could be a way, which could be perhaps fruitful to examine climate change and what companies do or don't do. So perhaps we don't have the time to get the prices right. We have other theoretical models, other constructs and ideas from other social sciences that we need to emphasize instead of just spending time, which has been years, if not soon decades, to get the prices right, and then the market will act in the right way. Yes, we have had a carbon trading scheme within the EU. Yes, this has led to some sort of improvements, but the question is whether we can afford to wait much longer, and we might need to take non-economic measurements, more political science measurements or activities to prepare us better and to reduce emissions. There we have that word again there. Now, I'm sure that someplace in the book there's a talk about mitigation and adaptation, but I decided that this is probably the right time to say something about this. I'm not sure about exactly in the rest of the environmental studies program where this is talked about. Some of you may feel like that you're going to yawn because you know this already, but for those of you who are not used to the terms, in international discussions about climate change, frequently there's a distinction between mitigation and adaptation. And mitigation is anything which would reduce the effects of human activities on the climate system. By banning particular activities, by putting prices on particular activities, and so forth, that within a short or longer period of time, that our impacts on the climate system are reduced, or perhaps the growth in our impacts are leveled out and then begin to decline. And here it, of course, also has to do with, say, agricultural practices, and not just manufacturing sector, transport sector, energy sector, and also has to do with changes in human lifestyle. Everything which in small ways or big ways adds up to a slowing in the growth of impacts, and then a plateau, and then a decline. Then we come to adaptation, the other side of this, which is that, well, some sort of climate change is unavoidable. And if you talked about it this way 20 years ago, you were thought of as a loser, because all our effort should be spent on mitigating. I would suggest that maybe now we need to deal with both mitigation and adaptation, and places around the world and companies around the world that have been struck by some sort of climate change event or a series of climate change events become more interested in adaptation rather quickly when they realize that, okay, we had a lot of disruption. And adaptation could be in a number of different things. It could be also lifestyle, because then we are adapting the way we live in some ways to prepare us for some sort of climate change. And this might be the adaptation of where we live, if we have the ability to do that. Adaptation would also mean that at a national level, there could be decisions made about building, say, transport infrastructure. It could be that if new hospitals are going to be built, that they are built in such a way that the need for heating and cooling in the hospital is reduced, so they are less susceptible to extreme weather events. And sometimes we do things which are a mix of adaptation and mitigation. If we look at Malmö and we look at the entrance to the so-called city tunnel at Malmö Sea, the part which is close to Anna Lindh's Platz and the Malmö University building Niagara, the entrance to go down into the underground level where the trains are, in some cases, they're facing directly to the canal. And nobody thought about the fact, apparently, that someday in the future, sea level will be higher. And when there are awful storms, the water might come rolling right down to the tracks through the escalator and so forth. Nobody thought about that, because if they did think about it, they could have very simply reoriented the entrance away from coming up in the direction of where the canal is. And then they could build some sort of temporary wall to protect it or like that. But instead, parts of the city tunnel are maladapted to coming climate change. And Sweden is supposed to be such a great country when it comes to the environment, and yet such enormous infrastructure costing billions of crowns to build is not prepared for coming climate change. And I'm sure that decisions are being made now in some places in Sweden, and just not Sweden, where nobody is paying any attention to coming climate change. And we are building us into an infrastructure which is going to be very expensive and very disruptive in the future. That's the kind of thing that some of you in the future could hopefully reorient some decisions so that there will be less of an impact on critical infrastructure in the future. So if we look at companies and mitigation, we have, of course, everyday activities taking place in the company. And the everyday activities where we can make some sort of changes that might lead to some sort of reduction of emissions during that particular year or during some coming years. And of course, there are companies which do this. They want to be able to say to their customers that we are doing something having to do with the climate. So buy from us and don't buy from the others that aren't doing anything else. There are companies which make changes in where they are purchasing energy for their manufacturing, or for their hotels, or for their offices, or whatever it is. And those kinds of changes through time will lead to perhaps some sort of change, given enough time, in the energy sector in general. Something which companies might not be doing quite as much, but probably will be doing more of in the future, have to do with logistics and sourcing of supplies. And if we have some critical key points where where there are sort of like bottlenecks, or like in a needle where you're threading a needle, a particular choke point in the logistics supplies where we think that there could be a disruption in the future because of climate change, and where these key bottlenecks are located in relationship to various customers and suppliers. First of all, we might make demands on those that transport things for us and try to have some sort of green logistics, which means that indirectly our company's environmental impact in forms of emissions is reduced. But we might also think about it might be important to redesign our entire flow of materials that are coming to us. We might think that that country is probably going to be affected by climate change more in the future, which might disrupt manufacturing of those key parts we need there. Maybe some of this manufacturing activity, it would make more sense to have it in a location which we think is less likely to be influenced by climate change in the future. And it's not just companies. Years ago, I read the nation state of Singapore, their climate change preparation plan about 10 years ago. And one of the most important things they said there was that since we are so dependent on supplies as a country, and not just as the companies located here, we may have to start to rethink about where we're buying things from. If they were getting a lot of their food from Australia, and Australia would start to have a lot of droughts, then that would very quickly lead to significant problems in a small country like Singapore, which doesn't produce a lot of its own food. So we can see that there's an awareness that exists in some companies and in some countries about this point 3 here, and to what extent they're starting to do something about that or not. The general climate action of their suppliers, when we have made changes with regard to 1, 2, and 3, maybe we need to put pressure on some of our suppliers to do something in a way which is taking place similar to just general environmental concern. And then we come to this more difficult part of the products, the goods and services we sell, or in some cases, perhaps we lease them and not just sell them. And by leasing them, we might retain some kind of environmental responsibility for the objects that we lease out, since we want to make sure that we get them back in good shape so we can continue leasing them. And then, of course, there are various networks that we could collaborate with in varying degrees. And there is also this idea of a value chain, that if we're a manufacturing company, that through our collaborators going back through the supply chain, all the way back to the original manufacturing and also perhaps extraction of a given raw material, that the value is being added onto it until it reaches us. And then we have the highest value and we can sell something with high value to customers. That's a sort of an economic business administration idea. Sometimes there's a link between traditional business administration and environmental management, that environmental management has to use some of the terms that exist in traditional business administration. And then adaptation, the same thing here. With regard to disruptions to supply chain, we might need new suppliers. We might, because this is by changing our suppliers, we may be mitigating, but we may also be adapting. And this is an example where the company might be doing a little bit of both in the same sort of decisions they're making. And some companies might make a partial retreat from just-in-time thinking for some critical things that they just cannot deal without, meaning that they need to build on-site a small, very small warehouse for a few things, instead of just relying on ships, airplanes, trains, trucks being a sort of a warehouse on wheels on the way to them. Macro issues, we might want to consider where some of our facilities are going to be in the future. It might not be such a good idea if we have several places where we can choose from. Putting it right on the coast might not be such a good idea in the future, unless, of course, we want to have it right by a harbor. It might not be a good idea to put it in a river valley where there's a tendency for 100-year flooding to become 20-year floods in the future. And then within a variety of sites where we might want to put something, we might want to consider the microclimate there. We might be able to reduce our cooling needs in the summertime, depending upon what is around our facility. We all understand the idea of a green roof that we have on our facility ourselves, but then we could think about the city itself. So we can imagine a future where, to what extent a city is talking about being a green city and having larger areas which don't hard surfaces and more parks and more green surfaces, that might mean that the cooling needs for a given facility might be lower. This doesn't seem to be like a major consideration that companies are having in their heads right now, but we can see how that potentially that could be something that could be involved in company decision-making. And then, of course, design for future climate, the buildings that we have ourselves and so forth, and where they were located in relation to critical infrastructure. And this is linked into mitigation. Again, that if we don't need to heat or cool our building as much in the future, we're not as vulnerable to the outside weather, to the outside climate, and we might even be able to produce some excess energy that we can sell on the market. And then those days when we need all of that to cool down our buildings, then we don't sell any energy that particular time. Then getting to the less sort of hard physical objects and to more how the workplace is organized. If we can reorganize some kinds of work because of pandemic, we might be able to reorganize things having to do with work and how it's organized because of climate change. I think that might be possible. The matters of human and social capital, by emphasizing the knowledge and experiences of the staff and the organizations within the company, maybe it'll be easier to figure out ways to adapt in the future, and the use of various kinds of scenarios, of course. Point one in adaptation, I think, was the question. Can I explain this? If companies have experienced or have experienced disruptions to the supply chain for various reasons, it might sort of at some point spring to mind on the part of some key decision makers in a company that, well, in the future, there might be disruptions to the supply chain, that where something is produced, there are disruptions, or getting the objects that we need to our various distribution points or to stores to sell to customers, or that customers are buying online, or whatever it is that's taking place, or that there are other companies which are buying from us, that we might want to look over the logistics and the supply chain. And this might lead us to thinking that we might need to have new suppliers. Okay, this supplier is selling us something and it costs a little bit more, but we guess that there's less of a likelihood that the supply chain will be disrupted. Better that we spend 5% more on buying certain things from another supplier than we have something which doesn't cost as much, but sometimes we'll have disruptions. And that might also mean that in some companies, for some key components, it might be that they sort of depart from just-in-time. The idea by just-in-time, which was pioneered in the 1970s in Japan, was that you didn't want to have an expensive warehouse where you had parts that you had there that you used at a particular period of time, or you didn't use, but you needed them very occasionally, but they were very essential, so you have them there. Instead, we save on costs by we sort of outsource the costs of having a warehouse to logistic companies who are constantly bringing us some supplies, and they're arriving just in time. that day or that week when we need them. And so the warehouse is on hundreds of lorries or trucks, or in aircraft, or in boats, on containers and so forth, on the way to us. And as soon as what we need is leaving a factory someplace else and has left that factory, it is part of our warehouse, except the warehouse is sort of split up among all kinds of logistic and transport companies around the world. So if there are disruptions to the supply chain, it could be that critical components, that companies will start stocking up on them and building small warehouses. In other words, it will be a partial return to the logistics prior to the 1970s. Perhaps, maybe. There are some companies that sort of are, are starting to say something along those lines now. But there's a certain inertia, so maybe it'll just be a handful of company and a handful of kinds of critical components that they will be trying to stockpile on site. Or maybe we need to have more disruptions before there's some sort of an understanding that might need to be some sort of change. Why will companies take action in this regard? Well, of course, there is customer demand, but I'm not quite sure how awareness of some of the things I'm talking about is necessarily going to lead to specific demands on the part of customers. There's sort of a general environmental demand on the part of the segments of the market, which could include climate in the future. Some companies may perceive that there is a market for being a, shall we say, approaching climate neutral company. And then we see all those mitigation activities that you'd have to, as a company, work your way through them. And also you'd be working your way through some sort of the adaptation, because you don't want to be, you want to have some sort of anticipatory surprise management to avoid the risk of being surprised 5 years down the road, 10 years down the road by some sort of climate change event or series of events. We can imagine that there could be regulations that could force companies to do certain things. Otherwise, we have companies that get hit by surprises and then react instead of being proactive, or they view things as a black swan. We, of course, might not view some of those things as being a black swan because we have some sort of socialization into understanding about climate change, and we have all been affected by the discourse and the framing of climate change, beginning in the natural science researchers and then moving on to economists and to others. Companies do carry out things that are called SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. And you can do that in the area of the environment and environmental management as well. Sometimes they carry out analysis which are much more sophisticated than those terms, but are ultimately based on looking at their strengths and their weaknesses and their opportunities and their threats. And sometimes strengths and weaknesses are viewed as internal activities in a company, and opportunities and threats are viewed as something external to the company, but not always. There's no set way of carrying out a SWOT analysis. And in their SWOT analysis, where they're not interested in the climate so much, they may start to come across that there are weaknesses and threats connected to climate, and then they'll start taking action. And there could be other stakeholders that start saying something about climate, and this particular company starts feeling like they need to do something about it. And the activities could also be oriented along this so-called value chain. Now we're not going to have any time for the discussion.